still don't know what I was waiting for. Time is running wild, a million dead-end streets, and every time I thought I got it made, it seemed the taste was not so sweet. Then I turned myself to face me, but I never caught a glimpse of how the others must see the faker. I'm much too fast to take that test.
I know you did something on best practices, right? But one of the things I've never seen about best practices is how do you know if your model is already in a good or a bad practice? Your starting point is X. Your starting point is whatever your model is at the time. And you've got these folks coming in, Phil, Steve, Albert, Lars, whomever, saying, oh, it's good practice. But how do you even figure out if you have good or bad practices in your model?
Yeah, well, actually, that's a good point, because that was one of the sort of opening sections of the presentation, was talking about that, because a lot of people don't even know what the concept of good practice is really, and they've got their models that they've had for 10 years, 15 years, whatever it is, and they all work and have done for a long time. But so I started from the point of what would be some initial signs that your models are not good practice. And typically it could be things that the models are a bit buggy. They don't, they have got little quirks in them that don't work well for whatever reason, and that reason might not be known. And when you want to update the models, how long does it take? Is it a laborious process just to get updates done? And some of those updates might be simple updates in concept, but difficult in practice. So I talk about that part of it is, well, if you're experiencing some of those issues, then maybe you're not in a good place with your approaches, because it's starting to hinder you, cost you money or whatever. And then from there, I do talk a little bit about my training, because that has a good practice approach.
Which is a good point. First, you have to start with what you have and understanding what you have, and then you have to understand where to go. My experience shows me that most people that are have been working in a company for a while that weren't involved with the actual implementation of the model, they already think they have a good practice.
Yes.
And they don't have a clue what their model really does. Where I always started was, you know what, spend some time and use whatever tool you're comfortable with. Personally, I always use Visio, but use whatever. And go through your model piece by piece, level by level, and document it. And then the problem comes with, how do you know if it's standard or non-standard? Right. Because there might be something that happens that bounces out to a user exit, and shit, how do you find that? Especially if the guy like me decided to retire 5 years ago and you can't get hold of his ass, or he doesn't want to talk to you, right? This is where I find those documents of here's what my model does very important. And I've heard people talk about, you have to split it into, here's the sales portion and here's the MRP portion, and you can ignore the MRP portion. I disagree with that, because the MRP portion, one thing I've found people do quite often is they instantiate too deep in their model, much deeper than they need to go, and they don't understand why. And MRP could be running a hell of a lot faster. Sales orders could be running a whole hell of a lot faster if you just really understood what parent meant.
Yeah, no, that's true. Yeah, so I've had some of my customers have done my training for good practices, and then that's nothing like our models, the way we've built them, and so that sort of gives them a benchmark where they can, like you said before, this is what I've got now, where could the target be? But doesn't necessarily mean that an existing model you can actually get it to that good practice target. And so that's what I've experienced in recent times, working with a couple of companies who did exactly that. Basically, they worked out their existing models weren't great in their approach, and so we're basically using two main strategies to improve that. In some cases, an existing model, you can start incorporating some good practice approaches to make some of the things work better. So you might introduce some constraints. If you don't have them currently, you might introduce some better naming conventions, whatever it is, and you might be able to make those models a bit better. But at some point, a lot of them, they come to the point where this model is getting tired now. It's almost out of date in terms of the product even, and they'll pick some products and then build from scratch. And so really bottom up, clean slate.
Well, that's a point that a lot of, I haven't heard anybody talk about, right? Is when do you move the model from X to Y? And product development is, in my opinion, the perfect spot to do that. You know, you've got this product that's been out there for however long, maybe it's a year, maybe it's 20 years, right? But it's time to update that product. Extremely early in the project, back in design, where your design architects are doing conceptual drawings of what they think this one wants to be. That's really when you need to intercede and say, time out, we need to construct this model in a way so that it conforms to our ERP systems and our third-party systems best practices. And my experience is the first thing that you get is, what the hell do I care? From the design engineers, right?
Yeah.
And your response needs to be something like, the reality of it is the only time we can do this for the business and make it successful is when we revise the product. And do you want the company to be in business in 10 years? That means you can't do what you've always done. Because as the old saying goes, if you do what you've always done and expect different results, you're insane.
Yeah, no, it's true. And it's been an interesting process. With one company, yeah, we were going through the whole design framework, if you like, of how the model will look with its class structures and variant table constraints, the whole bomb thing, whatever. But then as we got into it, they're saying, oh, but we're now in the process of implementing this PLM, which we want to use that as the rule generator essentially, and how do we integrate that? And then as the project got momentum, people on the production end were becoming interested because they had some interfaces into machines and things. And so you had to weigh up, does that constrain what you can do within VC or not? Because the scope of depends on the scope of the project that the company wants to do. Do they want to just really get their models to a nice place? Or are they actually feeding out sideways to all the interfaces, to all the inputs, whatever it is, and making it a bigger project than what you started?
Well, but VC it impacts everything about your business.
Yeah.
And this is why I disagree with the concept of, oh, we only need to care about the sales model from a best practice approach.
Yeah.
And PLM, as we talked in our last one, is really more about the low-level bomb explosion, the MRP bomb explosion. It's not about the sales configurator explosion. And how do you generate those CNC programs? How do you populate the drawings automatically into the production order? Things of that nature. There are best practices for that. Nobody ever talks about them at CWG because, let's face it, the CWG is focused on high-level config. They don't seem to care about low-level config, and they never have. In my 20-plus years of experience, you talk about low-level config in the CWG, and they go away. And I really believe that low-level config is every bit as important as high-level config to the CWG.
Yeah, no, I think so. And I'm sure there'd be some good customer stories that could come out at the CWG, touches on those sorts of things, because, yeah, sometimes in the VC world, we get very engrossed in how elegant we can make the model, and that perspective outside of it gets lost sometimes with the practicalities. But Yes, in those cases, if you can start from, call it a greenfield situation with rebuilding a model, I think there's a lot of advantages. And the guys I'm working with, they could see pretty immediately what a huge difference it makes, and how they view the setup of the model and how it can be maintained into the future and that. So it's been really good to see that sort of response. And then these guys also are doing the day-to-day with their existing models, and every now and then they'll show me stuff where they go, oh, we've applied this constraint invariant table to solve this problem, and so they integrate bits and pieces of good practice. But yeah, and of course the big thing ultimately, if people do decide to go to the AVC, it's probably an exercise they have to do anyway.
Yeah.
Because
the AVC was deliberately designed with constraints in mind, right? Yeah. But again, high level config only, that's all they gave a shit about. They didn't care about anything else, right? And this is where I think the CWG fails its members, is that they talk about best practices and so forth and so on. And Phil, you do a great job with your training program in telling people, here are some of the things you should be doing, right?
Yeah.
But as a whole, the CWG, my opinion, does not push best practices as hard as they should. So one of the best presentations I ever saw was from Nicole Krull. And the reason it was one of those best ones is because she went through the document share and she pulled out all of the various best practice presentations. And it's still out there somewhere. I think it's Budapest. I think it was 2019 Budapest or 2018. I don't even remember at this point. But she did a great job at pulling that out. But the CWG is too focused on, my opinion again, here's cool, neat stuff that we want to sell you that may or may not ever happen.
Yeah. No, there's an element of truth. Like when there was not an AVC, you very rarely heard SAP talk about best practice or good practice approaches to VC, because the SAP help didn't explain it. A lot of their training courses didn't explain it. And when the AVC came along, they suddenly magically went, oh, constraints, that's what we need to do. And because the engine is basically a constraint engine in the AVC as its primary method. But yeah, so they've changed their tune. I don't know if their training has changed over time, but
SAP training? Nah. But to your point, the whole reason I wrote Restricting Characteristic Domains back in 2005 was because I was at a CWG conference in fall of 2001. And I stood up and I asked SAP, I said, why don't you guys tell us what we need to do from a modeling perspective to be able to fit into your future directions? And they said, that's the customer's problem. The customer should figure out what the best practices are. And the gentleman that told me that, I love him to death, still worked for SAP. He's one of my favorite people at SAP. He was very young at the time, say that. But when he told me that, it was like, what the hell? You just want to suck money out of us and you really don't give a crap if we succeed or not? And I'm sensing that attitude again from SAP. It shifted over the years to more about, yeah, how can we bring more customer stories in that tell us good stuff about this? And now it's back to, oh, we're going to sell you this and you need to spend X amount of dollars and do Y and such.
I think you put it correctly. The focus does switch from SAP, and it's at the end of the day, they're a software.
Yes.
That's their business.
But it's like any other company, right? You don't succeed without your customers. If your customers aren't successful, you will not be successful. And I agree. There are more business transactions running through SAP software than any other piece of ERP software in the world. I agree completely. And I'm very thankful that SAP has developed what they've developed. But I also think they're still very much behind the times. If you look at what they've presented over the past 5 years, I think back and I go, wait a minute. I'm not in 2010 or 2015, 2020 plus. All this shit you're talking about happened many years ago,
Mm.
and you're just now getting there.
Anyway, it is what it is at the moment, and
We'll talk about that next time. We'll see.
yeah. Actually, I think our recording time's going to finish in a minute, Steve.
I think so, yeah. So maybe we should say to all of you folks at the CWG, I hope you enjoyed Dubrovnik. Croatia looks like a beautiful place. I wish I could be there, but nah. And same goes for New Orleans. Been there, done that, not going back. So y'all have a good time in New Orleans and stay off of Bourbon Street.
I assume that's from personal experience. So
Twice.
yeah. Okay, Steve. No, that's great. I think we'll wrap up on that one.
All righty, Phil, you take care now.
Okay, you too.
Changes. Look out on your rock and rollers. Changes. Pretty soon now you're gonna get older. Time may change me, but I can't trace time. I said that time.